when I finish a book, I review it at Goodreads and pretty much move on. So if you want to know what I read for the last year and a half, well, every one of them is reviewed over at Goodreads. And I'm very happy about that. Well, I read 9 books during the month of July, and hey, I'm 71 years old. I'm an old lady, and I don't remember all the details of everything that I read during the month. So what I did was I printed out my Goodreads reviews, and I will probably read some of these to you, maybe all of them, I don't know. Okay, the first book that I finished, I have to tell you, I always count a book in the month in which I finish it. Now this first one, I probably finished it. Okay, it says I finished it July 1st. And it's Purpose and Prayer by E.M. Bounds. So I read that really in June, but I finished it July 1st, so it's counted in my July books. How about that? I wrote, if this book doesn't make you want to go pray, I don't know what would. The advice in the book ranges from extremely inspirational to downright preachy, as in, you sinners, go pray if you want something. Pray loud, pray at length, pray repeatedly. Your future depends on it, as well as the future of others you may be praying for. Leave no stone unturned. Prayer is essential. Having read the entire book now, I'm very much thinking I need to go pray somewhere, private, more intensely than ever before. If I don't, I'll be missing out on great opportunities to help others. Final analysis, this book is amazing. I hope I managed to put the great advice into personal life practice. So a friend of mine messaged me about that review and said it sounded like I didn't like the book, I guess, when I was talking about it being preachy, but it really did come off that way to me at times, and I really did like the book anyhow, because I do manage to read a lot of books about prayer. I've never really felt confident in my prayer life. Let's say, okay, I became a Christian when I was 61. And before that, I had belonged to a cult sort of group that had a prayer book. And so if I wanted to read a prayer, if I wanted to say a prayer, I would just read one. And then when I became a Christian, it was like I had to really talk to God, and it's been a learning process for me, so I read a lot of books about prayer. The second book that I finished during the month of July was July 3rd. I finished Ship of the Line. I gave it 3 stars because of the violence level. Let's just say the violence level in this one went over my tolerance level. So this is another book in the Horatio Hornblower series that I've been reading this year. And I'm not sure which one in the series it is. Maybe 7th or 8th. Captain Horatio Hornblower of the English ship Sutherland emerges as a short-tempered warmonger. He seems to be happiest when anticipating battles. His saving grace is his love for a certain unborn child. In the end, he gets his comeuppance, more or less. I do wish these novels were not so violent, but that's war, and this is a tale of the English Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. Hornblower is also unfortunately caught between 2 women. First, there is his pregnant wife, Maria, to whom he is physically faithful while not 100% appreciating her. And second, there is Lady Barbara, a considerably more attractive woman who he fell in love with during the 6th novel of the series. She has married someone else, however, so things aren't looking great for any real relationship with her. I'm reading these books with a few other booktubers because I was curious and wanted to know what was in them. This is the 7th novel of 11 in the series. I'm giving this one only 3 stars because of the level of violence, one battle after another, hundreds of men killed, no thousands. It was just terrible, really. I don't like violence in books, but I've had to get used to it during this Hornblower series because it's in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. The next book that I finished in the month of July, on July 5th, was a surprise to me. I read a recently written and published novel called The Midnight Library by Haig, H-A-I-G. This is a fantastic magical realism book. I recommend it. The main character is Nora Seed. She has hit a rough patch in life and everything seems to go wrong for her. Her only living relative won't talk to her. She loses her job, her relationship ended, and more. She transfers to a strange library where all the books represent different paths she could have taken through life. She's not dead, but is on the edge between life and death. It is up to her to explore the various options she could have experienced and to decide which is best. I found this book to be fascinating and unputdownable. I read through it very quickly. For those concerned about clean literature, this is fairly clean. There was nothing that interfered with my enjoyment of the story. Sex is mentioned but not described. And that's one of those books that I really enjoyed, but it must be my age. I just can't retain everything that I've read during the month. So I didn't really remember much about that novel until I read you my review. Still recommended. I thought it was wonderful. The next novel I finished on July 9th, and it is Touch Not the Cat by Mary Stewart. I appreciate this novel because I also have the mind talk gift, but not in exactly the same way as Proenneke, the main character in this book. I was amazed to be reading about this in a novel. It is something most people never talk about, let alone write about. I wonder if author Mary Stewart also had this experience, as that would be a reason she would want to include it in a novel. In Proenneke's case, it was supposedly something she could do only with another member of her family. She'd had a mind talk relationship with a man since they were children, but she didn't know exactly who the man was. She grew up with 3 male cousins and thought it was one of them. This all is revealed in chapter 1, so this is not a spoiler. I very much identified with her doubts and concerns about the gift, and seriously was blown away to be reading all this in a novel. In Proenneke's case, she very much believed she was in a valid romantic relationship with some guy whose identity she was unsure of. I thought that could lead to disaster and was very interested in seeing how it would all turn out. Like most Mary Stewart books, this book is entirely clean. There is a conversation about sex in chapter 17, as I recall, but not really a sex scene of any kind. The next book that I finished during the month of July, on July 17th, is The Gold in These Hills. Here's my review. This is a beautiful Christian fiction, and it is only somewhat romantic, really. It is set in a California town around 1903, Kenworthy. The history of Kenworthy is real. It was a mining town in Southern California that quickly went bust because the gold in the mine was seeded, put there to intentionally deceive an investor to build a town for miners to seek out gold that didn't actually exist. A miner named John Cohen advertised for a mail-order bride. San Francisco-born Juniper responded and moved to Kenworthy, where they married. We come into the story when their first child is several years old already, and John has inexplicably vanished. Juniper is heartbroken and struggling to earn money as a laundress. She writes letters to John but can't mail them as she doesn't know where he is. This is a dual timeline novel. Many years later, a man named Johnny buys the house that the Cohen family once lived in. His intention is to renovate it and flip it, or maybe just live there forever. The remote isolation of the house serves his mood well, as his wife is divorcing him and he's miserable about it. So that's the setup of the novel. I wouldn't say this is a romance novel. It is more just good historical fiction that calls our attention to the plight of those left behind when a tiny town turns into a ghost town. Everyone else moves away and only a few are left. Juniper doesn't want to leave because she hopes her husband will someday return and he won't find her unless she stays in one place. There are a few Native Americans in this novel. They aren't main characters, but they do show up in more than one storyline. Cleanliness factor, 100%, much appreciated. The novel is well written and the author doesn't hide her Christianity. Yeah, I really liked that novel. Recommended. 5 stars. The Gold in These Hills. Now the next novel that I finished is The Hollow Hills. It's the second Mary Stewart novel that I read during July. I finished it on July 18th. Here's my review. This is the second novel in the Arthurian saga. I thought I'd never read it because I wasn't happy with the violence in the first novel, The Crystal Cave, but this one really did keep my goodwill and attention better, and now I feel willing to read the third novel in the series. There are only 2 things bothering me about this novel. First, there was a lot of pagan god worship going on in England in those days, and the main character, Merlin, is definitely pagan. Not Christian, although the country is warming up to Christianity and Arthur has been baptized. The other thing that bothered me is that all the important characters in this novel are men. There are a few women with brief roles and some don't seem to have good reputations. I actually felt compelled to read a different novel with female characters midway through this one, as the focus on men in the Hollow Hills was just too much for me. I know most people won't have this concern, but it means something to me. I love Mary Stewart's romantic suspense novels with female main characters, but I'm not quite so enthusiastic about this Arthurian saga. Still, it is well written, no doubt about that. Mary Stewart's writing skills are obvious in this novel, just like in the other novels she's written. Cleanliness factor. Well, there's one sex scene late in the novel, but it wasn't graphically described. Also, there's violence, but not a lot, and again, not graphically described to any extent that I would feel horrified by it. I'm very sensitive about violence in novels. Any violent scenes that would stay in my memory long after I'm done reading the novel are too violent for me. The next novel I finished on July 20th, and it is Christian fiction. And I gave it 5 stars. Like most of these novels, the only one I didn't give 5 stars to was The Hornblower. And to be honest, I'm very liberal with 5 stars. Some of them could have gone to 4 stars, but it's just the way I am. If I don't have any particular reason to knock off a star, I won't. So this one is A Shelter of Hope by Tracie Peterson. What an original idea for a novel. The author wrote a series of 3 novels set in Fred Harvey restaurants. This is the first one. I think the 3 are all fairly unrelated, except that the main characters work as Harvey girls. I was tempted to give this one 4 stars, but finally settled on 5. I had a few minor quibbles with the writing style, and this is the first time I've read anything by this author. I will be happy to read more if they ever appear in my field of availability. This was one of those precious Christian fiction novels I read as my literary candy when I should be reading something else. It is like snacking on cookies when I should be eating a healthy, well-rounded dinner of some kind. This time I was supposed to be reading another Hornblower novel and or Frankenstein, both for a booktube read-alongs, but no, I had to read my Christian fiction instead, and I am glad I did. This one started with a sweet, innocent 17-year-old girl living with the most brutally abusive father one could imagine. He didn't sexually abuse her, but everything else, and then some. She escapes, but not without a huge burden of trauma, and makes her way from the remote mountains of Wyoming to the training center for Harvey girls in Kansas. That's all I'm going to tell you. If you want to know more, read the book. Cleanliness factor 99%, taking off 1% because there was some kissing and hugging. Like most Christian fiction, this one doesn't cross any major lines for me. There's also a bit of violence, such as life, when there's an evil villain seeking to oppress a young woman in terrible ways. The next book that I finished in July, on July 25th, is One Man's Wilderness, an Alaskan Odyssey. I already did a video about this book, really enjoyed it. Here's my review. On Goodreads, I thought Chapter 9, Reflections, was worth the price of admission, and listened to it twice. Speaking of the price, this is one of those audiobooks that Audible offers free to subscribers in the Plus catalog, so I didn't spend much, but I enjoyed the book a lot. Most of this book is a day-by-day journal of a man's adventure at isolated Twin Lakes in Alaska. He decided to build a cabin and lived there alone for 16 months back in the 1960s. Of course, the animals, many of them, did not leave him alone for long. He had plenty of company. Some might not like the slow pace of reading a man's journal, but I truly love books like this. I've done a lot of journaling myself. After that year, he went home to Iowa for the winter, but returned to his cabin the following year. He lived there for most of the next 30 years, and he willed the cabin to the National Park Service. And the last book that I finished during the month of July is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Well, I finally did it. I read Frankenstein, and it was nothing like I had imagined. Who was Frankenstein, and what terrible things did he do? So now I know. Victor Frankenstein was an idiot college student who decided to rob graveyards and put bits and pieces together to form a man. He managed to bring the monster man to life, and then all hell broke loose. Great story, seriously, well written. I'm not a fan of the horror genre, but still I admire well-written literature when I see it. Awesome, but terrible at the same time. So that's my wrap-up, and forgive me for having to read my book reviews, but I just can't store all that information in my head. Thank you for listening to my video, and I hope that you'll come back for another one.